It's part 3 of my quest to review every Chilla's art game. Woo! First off, I'd like to thank you for the surprising amount of support on the previous videos. Seriously, I never could have imagined they'd do so well, and I'm so grateful that they seem to be of value to a lot of viewers. If this is the first video of mine that you've watched, I highly recommend going back and watching the previous ones in this series so that some of my opinions have context. I'll include links to them in the description for anyone interested. Now, without further ado, let's dig into the next batch of games from Chilla's art. The Caregiver begins by placing you in the shoes of Sachi, a healthcare worker. She's working late at the hospital and gets an emergency call from a client. Before heading there, you get a chance to explore a section of the hospital. This environment is so very quiet and eerie, and it captures that late night hospital shift vibe perfectly. Not that I would know though, to be honest, but it captures what I imagine a late night hospital shift to be like. Anyway, you head off to the client's residence, and to get there you traverse a wonderfully spooky city block. I love how the different coloured lights of the windows, street lights and traffic lights stand out so much amongst the dense oppressive mist, like comforting beacons in a space of unknown horrors. After making the trek up a hill to the client Soichi's house, you enter to find the halls filled with rubbish bags and cardboard boxes. Litter and dirt is scattered across every surface, so much so that it looks like nobody could possibly live here. The scene immediately struck me as very reminiscent of the start of Ju-On the Grudge, where similarly a healthcare worker enters an elderly woman's house and finds the place in complete disarray. That isn't the only similarity I noticed between that film and this game, but I'll leave the rest until later. After some searching, you find Soichi sitting in his wheelchair, staring blankly out the window. He's clearly not in his right mind and has also soiled himself. After cleaning it up, you explore another section of the house, and upon opening a sliding door to a room upstairs, you're faced with a dark, shadowy figure seemingly feasting upon something, or someone. Another figure, wearing a casa, stands behind you, obscured at the edge of the frame. This moment actually plays out as a cutscene, and while Chilla's art have used cutscenes in their games before, I feel like they really should not have used one here. It completely took me out of the moment and ruined any sense of fear or tension that had built up until that point. I'm not against scary visuals, but when I know that I'm completely safe in that moment from the scary thing, then I don't feel any fear. The cutscene ends and we now step into the shoes of Sachi's sleepy colleague, Naomi. Naomi has to cover for Sachi since she's been out for a few days following the incident we just experienced. We make our way again to Soichi's residence atop the hill, and once we arrive we again need to tend to his needs while also solving various puzzles to do so. One puzzle, in which we need to unblock the bathroom so that Soichi can take a bath, has us look for a garden tool and something to stand on so that we can reach into the high window and knock the plank blocking the door aside. Now, I'd noticed a ladder on the roof already, and after finding a garden tool I figured I could just use that to knock the ladder down for me to use to access the window, but the game wouldn't allow me to prop the ladder against the window. Instead, I had to use the ladder inside the house to access the attic, where I found a goddamn stool for me to stand on to access the window. What? You're telling me I had to use a ladder to acquire a stool so that I could reach the window, which I could have reached with the ladder to begin with? What kind of backwards logic is this? Even Silent Hill games don't have as nonsensical puzzles as this, and one requires you to throw a hairdryer into a pool of water to fry a hidden monster. This really annoyed me, but it's not the worst offender. You'll see why later. After bathing Soichi and putting him to bed, we move on to the next day. This time we go to pay Sachi a visit to learn more about the mysterious happenings at Soichi's house. After playing rock paper scissors and giving drugs to a guy outside her apartment building, we're allowed in. Sachi makes it clear that she wants nothing to do with that place, and as we leave, another cutscene plays, showing Sachi throwing herself over the balcony and falling to her death. Next thing we know, we're back at the hospital, but Naomi has a feeling she needs to return to Soichi. You run through the rain that only falls within a 20-meter radius of you and reach his house to find Soichi gone. You solve some more weak puzzles that follow a convoluted and unrealistically convenient throughline, the worst of which is how a package that arrived yesterday just so happens to contain a crank that you need to use with a car jack to open a sliding door. It was so dumb that I found myself taken aback when I opened the package. Clearly there was no thought or care put into making these puzzles seem even remotely plausible, so I won't dwell on it any longer. Through the open door you find a crowbar and a note telling you to dig up the floor somewhere, so you head off and immediately find the exact spot to open. It doesn't make sense that Naomi would know the precise location to remove the tatami mat, but I'm not supposed to be dwelling on these things, so I'll move on again. The hole leads to an underground cave system that houses a ritualistic altar containing Soichi, his face covered by a tengu mask. He floats in midair, surrounded by a dark, billowing fog. A note beside him tells you need to change the times on all the house's clocks to stop the ritual, so you head off to do just that. However, you're now being chased by the resurrected soul of Soichi's wife, Haori. This seriously comes out of nowhere, and I was not prepared for it in the slightest. After changing the clock times while doing your best not to get stabbed too much by Haori, you acquire a special dagger and plunge it into Soichi's possessed body. This frees him from the curse, and he tasks you with retrieving Haori's bones from an altar upstairs so that her soul may also be freed from the curse. Haori no longer chases you through the house, but once you retrieve her bones, you're ambushed by the Karasu Tengu spirit itself. He chases you through a maze of connecting rooms until you find the right one, which leads you to this weird Tron hallway that allows you to escape the house. The game ends here, and a text crawl explains how Naomi sought refuge at a nearby temple where she could bury Haori's bones, putting her to rest. After this, a cutscene shows Soichi and Naomi attending Haori's grave. As the camera approaches the two, we see Soichi develop long red nails on his hands and feet, as well as a set of jet black wings. The Tengu laments, saying how Soichi was already gone from the moment you set foot in the house. Honestly, I really enjoyed the Caregiver, but it definitely had its flaws though. I found the puzzles to be very weak. They're pretty much the same as the usual Chilla's Art puzzles, but the context really didn't make any sense for them in this game. The story was actually fairly interesting, much more engaging than any other Chilla's Art game I've played, and I hope they try more stuff like this in future games. The visuals were great, as usual. I would have liked more visual scares that weren't confined to cutscenes, but the audible scares nearly made up for that. There are moments where you're walking through the house and you hear a scratching on the wall beside you, yet when you investigate, there's nothing there. It was particularly unnerving, as it always reminded me of Toshio scratching at the closet door in Ju-on the Grudge. Speaking of which, I like how you experience the curse from multiple people's perspectives over different time periods in this game. It's not told in a non-linear fashion like in Ju-on, but that's because there'd be no need to, since there's only 2 playable characters. I appreciate that Chilla's Art were trying new things in their walking sim type games with the introduction of these chase sequences. It's a really intense and sudden twist in a game that is so characteristically slow paced, and I absolutely loved it. Well, the first time anyway. The Haori chase worked well because you had to try and lose her somewhere in the house so that you had enough time to wind the clocks. This made it super tense, yet the second chase segment with the Tengu was nothing but sprinting blindly through random rooms until you're lucky enough to find the right one, and if you don't find it in time, the screen goes dark and all you can do is wait until the Tengu catches up and kills you. It's just frustrating. The fact that I died through no fault of my own here ruined the segment for me, although the Tengu's design was pretty cool, so I won't say it was 100% terrible, more like 95% terrible. And that's the Caregiver, a somewhat messy game that is overall enjoyable so long as you don't dwell on its faults. I'm not sure how my experiences with the next few games will go, as they're getting to the point where my laptop is struggling to run them, let alone record footage. It's ironic how a game with such low fidelity visuals can be so hard to run on a decent computer, but I guess I can't complain too much since at least I can actually run these games for the most part. Anyway, on to the next game. Night delivery begins with you opening up the back of your truck to start unloading the packages that you'll deliver to the nearby apartment block. Immediately I was impressed by the intimidating structure that towered over me. It worked really well with the VHS filtered visuals and gave the building a foreboding presence. I couldn't help but sneak peeks at the upper balconies in case there was someone watching me from above, which there actually was at one point. It's very spooky. I also noticed that there was a lot more work put into the audio in this game to make the urban environment feel all the more authentic. Wind would blow audible bits of rubbish around me and the air conditioning fans would rattle as I passed them. It did well to immerse me in the location. As for the gameplay, the first part of the game has you delivering 5 or so packages to residents in different parts of the building. I believe you can only carry 1 package at a time, although I didn't try to pick up more than 1 for some reason, so you need to keep going back to the truck to collect the next one. Each delivery has you interact with a strange individual living in the apartment complex. These range from a hikikomori who sends you on a frustrating, repetitive, and ultimately pointless quest to have a nearby priest purify his package, a mother that tasks you with retrieving her child for her after it escapes the apartment, and a shy yet unpleasant woman who makes you assemble her bed frame for her after delivering it. None of these interactions with these characters really worked towards the game's horror atmosphere in my opinion. They were all fairly goofy, and none of the things they asked you to do for them were very interesting or rewarding. Instead of creeping me out like they were probably supposed to, they just pissed me off and left an increasingly sour taste in my mouth for the rest of the game. During the quest to retrieve the escaped child, which the mother doesn't help with at all by the way, you end up in an alternate reality or hallucinated version of the apartment complex. Many of the apartments are blocked off by strange walls and ladders that reach up over the balconies to connect them, like a weird game of Donkey Kong. In this section, you need to revisit each apartment you delivered to in order to acquire a note left by another mysterious resident, the backstory of which I'll get into later. The latter segment ends with, quite frankly, an awful fucking jump scare that has almost no build up and did nothing but startle and frustrate me. If you've watched my previous Chilla's Art videos, you'll know how much I hate shitty jump scares, and this was just that. After delivering the last parcel, you find another one in your truck that wasn't there before, but hey, you're a good worker, so you'll deliver it anyway. The address on the parcel is apartment 404, and when you get there, the door suspiciously opens by itself. Not fazed by this or the demonic white noise blaring from the intercom beside it, you enter to find the place empty except for an odd fridge sitting in the middle of one room. Upon interacting with it, your vision begins to fill with static and mutilated bodies appear on the floor around you. Eventually, the screen fades to a staticky black and you're put in the shoes of the building manager who was seemingly watching your point of view from his TV set, which I don't understand in the slightest. Seeing as how I'd just been in apartment 404 as the delivery man, I figured I had to head there as the manager to check things out. Once I get there, I enter the same room the delivery man had been killed in and am attacked from behind by a weird fridge carrying man, who I'd assume is the tenant of 404. That's where the game ends, and I got the second of two endings. I really wasn't impressed by this ending as it just seemed completely generic. I honestly don't think the context for it helps either because, as you may have noticed, I haven't even mentioned the antagonist's backstory yet because it's so weak. It all gets dumped on you during the latter segment and you find out that the guy in 404 is disabled and treated poorly by everyone else you meet. I'm assuming that he either murdered or cursed them and you end up getting caught in that somehow, but since all of this information was given to you at once, it just seems kind of lazy. I'd have much preferred if the exposition was sprinkled throughout the game instead of how it was presented. I didn't even bother to try and get the first ending because it just didn't seem worth it to me. I also have no idea what the fridge has to do with it, but I'm not replaying the game to possibly find out. Night delivery was really disappointing. It was far too slow paced for its own good, and any smidge of tension that it tried to build up was interrupted by the cans. Oh god, I haven't mentioned the cans yet. Okay, so Chilla's Art usually include collectible items in their games as rewards for their highest tier patrons. If you pledge just €86.50, you'll be included in their next game as some kind of collectible such as a gacha prize or a charm or something. They're usually fine and are relatively unobtrusive Easter eggs, but in Night Delivery they're on a whole other level. In this game, the collectible item is a can of soda, themed after the patron. They can be found throughout the game and you'll find most of them through regular gameplay. However, when you approach one, it'll make a loud rattling sound that helps you locate it. This not only doesn't make sense because it's just a regular soda can, not a sentient soda mascot begging for your attention, but it also completely destroys any ounce of tension that the game had at that point. And it's not like it's a rare occasion either. You'll barely be able to take 5 steps without hearing the immersion shattering clanging of a nearby hidden can for at least the first half of the game. It's awful, genuinely awful. I get that it's a good way for Chilla's Art to make money and please their patrons, but it ruins the game so much that it becomes completely intolerable and obnoxious. It really seems like they're prioritizing making money over making a good horror game that actually works as a horror game, not just fan service. I'm not hopeful for the future of Chilla's Art games if they continue to force their Patreon rewards into their games as much as this. It's already reached a point where the once beautiful essence of a Chilla's Art game has been tarnished and corrupted by greed and lack of integrity. We'll see how the next few games go, but I'll be honest, I'm going into them with a lot more caution than usual. Now, before I go any further, I must address a mistake I made in the last review. At the start of The Night Way Home, I became aware of a toggle that disables the patron collectibles in the game. I had seen this option in previous games, but had just assumed it was a menu to view the list of patron collectibles. There's not enough of an indication that this actually disables the content in-game, so even though I did make a big deal out of it in the last review, I don't feel 100% completely stupid, as it wasn't totally my fault that I didn't know. And yes, I know I could have just removed that part from the script earlier, but I still think my point stands. Sure, you can turn off the content if you want, but if you're a supporter, you're going to want to get your money's worth and find your collectible item, but then you'll also be subjected to the rest of them, which is what ruins the games in the ways I mentioned previously. So, if you posted a comment giving out to me about being wrong earlier, feel free to delete it. I'll pretend to have not seen it. Anyway, The Night Way Home feels fairly different to other Chilla's Art games, so much so that I thought they'd once again collaborated with the dreaded Nick's Tales. See my review of Teke Teke for context. It begins with a voice-acted intro that I actually enjoyed for the most part, except for the slightly inconsistent audio quality. The intro hints at a rumour of a girl running away from home, possibly due to domestic abuse. The protagonist we play as, Rina, also doesn't want to go home as she feels she too has a tough home life. As she heads home from school, she enters the subway, which is where we gain control of the character. Instantly I was taken aback by the unconventional choice to use a third-person camera for once. Although unusual, it did let me appreciate the vastly improved character models and animations. It was so nice to see a character in a Chilla's art game that actually looks human for a change, instead of whatever the hell this is. Now, although I was pleased with the characters themselves, everything else in this game looks like complete shit. And it's not because of bad environmental design, because many of the areas are ripped straight out of previous games. No, it's because of this game's utterly abysmal lighting system. It's not as bad at the start, but further into the game, the lighting gets so broken and inconsistent that it becomes very hard to play. Seriously, just look at this. Anyway, you begin to make your way through the subway and encounter a girl crying in the bathroom. Based on what she tells you, she seems to be the girl that ran away from home that we heard about earlier. She grabs you and the next thing you know, you're waking up on the bathroom floor, possibly hours after the station has closed. I'm not sure why nobody thought to check the bathrooms before shutting the exits, but whatever. You find a conveniently placed flashlight on the sink beside you and use it to traverse the darkened hallways in search of a way out. You're also introduced to this game's interesting mechanic of the anxiety meter, which fills up anytime you're not standing in direct light and will cause you to trip over yourself after reaching a panicked state. I say interesting, but I really shouldn't give it that much credit. On paper it sounds great, but in reality, if Rina is so scared of the dark that only direct light can comfort her, then why doesn't she shine the flashlight she has on herself? In addition to the anxiety mechanic, there's also a wandering ghost girl who stalks the halls in search of you and will chase you. If you have a panic attack while she's chasing you and trip, she'll attack you after you get up, but only after you get up. You're seemingly totally safe sitting on the ground in front of her for some reason. The first part of this game is spent trying to solve a few simple puzzles while trying to avoid the ghost girl. You eventually escape to the underground car park, where traversal becomes a bit more challenging. There are cars scattered everywhere as if abandoned, and this makes trying to flee the ghost girl slightly more difficult. At the same time though, it makes losing her easier, so it balances out nicely. The goal for this section is to make your way down to the bike storage to retrieve yours, but upon getting there you'll find it broken and mangled. It's fine though, as the door beside you mysteriously opens, allowing you to escape the car park. These first two parts were fairly quick and easy and didn't overstay their welcome. The same cannot be said for this next part, at least in my experience. Upon exiting the car park, you emerge into a large open city. You also find a charm that repels evil spirits, which is great because thus far you've been defenseless against the ghost girl. You use it the same way you do your flashlight, aiming it at the ghost to stop her from attacking you and driving her away. It soon becomes obvious how vital this item is in this section, as you'll have to collect 4 100 yen coins to afford a bus ticket home since your bike was broken. The coins themselves are scattered across the large city and are indicated by a sound effect when you're close by. Now, I'll be honest here, this section took me almost an hour to beat. The reason for this is simple, but extremely irritating. Somewhere in the city is the bus stop with a bus waiting, but in order to board it you need 400 yen, which is indicated by the bus stop sign. The sign actually tells you that you need 400 yen more to get home, no matter how many you have in your inventory. So I spent most of that hour running around with 4 100 yen coins in my inventory, still looking for 4 more. Also, it wasn't clear that I had to use the coins on the sign that tells you this, so I didn't even know that I could have finished this part as soon as I could have. I mean, where's the logic in paying for a bus at a sign beside the bus stop? In reality, you pay the bus driver when you get on the bus, so when I found that I still couldn't get on the bus to try and pay, it made me think that I was still missing something. This entire city section is a colossal fucking mess. I already mentioned the dreadful lighting, but I didn't make it clear just how terrible it is. The flashlight you get barely works. The in-game lighting is very inconsistent and will apply properly to some objects and textures while not doing so to others right beside them. The fog effect messes with the lighting so much that parts of the screen that should be well lit are pitch black, like they're obscured by some sort of demonic misty deity. The streetlights that act as your safe haven from the terrors of the darkness surrounding them seemingly turn off when you stand underneath them, making it very confusing as to whether or not you're actually standing within their cone of light. And then there's the ghost girl herself, who honest to God feels like she's only operating on a few lines of code. I understand that she's supposed to be this menacing presence that stalks you throughout the city, but she has absolutely no consistency in her movements. Sometimes she'll be floating down the road just a short distance away without noticing you, while other times she'll zoom in from halfway across the map to attack you. She also occasionally ignores the deterrent charm you're aiming at her and will attack you anyway, then disappear into the darkness like a goddamn Minecraft Enderman. I'll try to include some of my own footage here, even though it's so choppy, because I need you to understand just how awful of an experience this was. Looking at this, you'd think it was made by someone very new to game development, not someone with over 20 games released and almost 450 patrons supporting their work. It just seems way too buggy to be a finished game, but somehow it is. Oh, and even though she floats through the air, she still makes footstep noises when running towards you. Goddamn, it's like they weren't even trying. Anyway, after boarding the bus, you get off in your neighbourhood, or close to it at least. I mean, this is pretty much the same map as the one from Okari, and your house is located in an area with huge apartment blocks that more closely resembles the city from the previous section, which makes me think that Chilla's art just added this section for the sake of padding out playtime and used already existing assets to do it easier. The only significant moment in this area is a brief encounter with the ghost girl's pre-death form, and the rest of the time is spent trying to avoid the ghost while waiting for a fucking train to pass, which itself is an extremely irritating moment in this game. Before you reach the crossing, the barriers come down and you're forced to wait for a train to pass before continuing onwards. However, the train doesn't pass for almost 4 minutes. So you're left running around in circles in this tiny environment while the ghost constantly nips at your heels because there's not enough room to lose her, and even if you do manage to, there's nowhere to go to stop her from finding you again. I don't understand. I really don't. So after the barriers rise, you continue on to your neighbourhood where you have to solve a potentially decent puzzle to find your way home, which you've forgotten the location of somehow. The puzzle gets you to judge where your apartment is based on some information, but I don't think it gives you enough information to calculate the exact position. See, it implies the runaway girl lives in the opposite apartment block to you, and you can work out the floor that your apartment is based on these clues, which I did easily. But I figured since it mentioned that she waved out her window, that there'd be some kind of physical indication of this that would allow you to pinpoint which end of the building your apartment was on. But there wasn't, so I resorted to trying all the doors on the 4th floor and eventually found my home. It was so close to being an actually good puzzle, but just like the rest of this game, ended up completely falling apart. Once you get home, you find the place empty, and after a while of wandering around, the door opens and Rina's mother comes in. Although she was apprehensive about returning home at the start of the game, Rina is overwhelmed by love and appreciation for her mother, who is actually a good and caring mother. It was an interesting story with a valuable message, but it was just presented so poorly. Watching Rina experience what a truly undesirable home life is through the memories of the runaway ghost girl and then overcoming her bratty teenager hatred of her parents could have been really touching if the journey up until that point hadn't been so damn frustrating. The Night Way Home is, quite frankly, an awful game, and definitely one of Chilla's art's worst. I can't imagine how much more negative my experience would have been if I hadn't discovered that I could turn off the Patreon collectibles. This game feels unfinished, unrefined, and unengaging. It had 1 or 2 interesting ideas, but they were lost in a sea of jank and laziness. Honestly, if things continue the way they are, I'm not sure I'll be able to bring myself to make a part 4 to this series. These games just aren't worth the money to me anymore. Oh, and speaking of part 4, I'm going to leave this video here since it's already pretty long and the recent Chilla's art games seem to all be increasing in length compared to their earlier ones. Therefore, if I do decide to make another part of this series, the rest of the currently released games will be covered in that. Thank you for all the support so far, and I'm sorry that this video was so negative. I have no interest in warping my opinion to fit with the general consensus, so even though I once had aspirations of working closer with Chilla's art, I'm not going to write reviews praising what I actually believe to be lackluster games. Thanks for watching.